And joining us now with more on the recent anti-Semitic incident in Russia and on the global rise in anti-Semitism today is Israel's special envoy for combating anti-Semitism, Michal Cotler-Wunsh. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So what we witnessed last night in Russia was reminiscent of an attempted pogrom. I mean, can you now say this was an anti-Semitic attack, point blank, and not related to anti-Zionism or anti-Israel sentiment, as many would like to claim?
So we have to be very clear. Anti-Semitism is one and the same. The same anti-Semitism that fueled the atrocities of October 7th is the unfathomable anti-Semitism that then excuses, justifies, or denies the atrocities of October 7th, and in turn is the anti-Semitism that we have seen all over the world, as you said, in Russia last night, in Paris today, on the streets of Berlin, on the streets of New York, Washington, and on campuses around North America, that not only denies and justifies, but that hails Hamas, that calls the same charter that Hamas is committed to for the annihilation of the state of Israel and for the murder of Jews. It is one and the same anti-Semitism, and you touched upon the differentiation, which over time has let people sort of differentiate between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, except that October 7th pulled off a lot of masks, and among them is the mask that makes very clear that anti-Zionism is the modern mainstream strain of an ever-mutating hate, that is anti-Semitism, that has fueled this complete dedication for the murder of Jews and for the annihilation of their nation state. And that is what we have in front of us, not only in the atrocities of October 7th in Israel, but in the rest of the world as a response.
So as you said, we're not only seeing this in Russia, we're seeing it around the world in the streets of major cities, on college campuses. But many are saying, well, this isn't anti-Zionism, it isn't anti-Semitic, it's anti-Israel and anti-Israel government policy. I mean, how do you respond to that?
Well, I want to make very clear, anybody that cannot condemn the atrocities, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, the makings of genocide of October 7th, burning of babies, of families, rape of women, the bludgeoning, the murder, the abduction of hundreds, anybody who cannot condemn that has basically outed themselves as those that support this attack on our shared humanity, on civilization, not just on the state of Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people, and not just on Jews on that bloody Shabbat, and on Jews around the world as a result. And I want to make something very clear. We have a definition of anti-Semitism, and it includes the modern version of it, the mutated strain of it, of anti-Zionism. That definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, speaks of the dehumanization and the delegitimization and the double standards towards the proverbial Jew among the nations, that is the nation state. The dehumanization, the delegitimization, the double standards that enabled the atrocities of the Holocaust, barring the individual Jew from an equal place in society, is precisely what we are seeing in international institutions, on the streets of major cities, on university campuses, that has just morphed into this mutated strain of anti-Semitism that bars the Jewish nation state from an equal place in the family of nations. And we would be remiss if we don't absolutely pull the masks off and say it is one and the same. The same anti-Semitism that enabled the atrocities of the Holocaust is the anti-Semitism that enabled the atrocities of October 7th, and the anti-Semitism that fuels the responses that deny, that justify, that celebrate them, and that never again is right now.
And we're seeing so much anti-Semitism around the world, and I want to ask you, where do you see the root of this anti-Semitism coming from today? Where is the main source, the main cause of this anti-Semitism that we're seeing over the last 3 weeks and before that?
So it's not just the last 3 weeks. I'll say that it's decades long of the mutation of this hate that, as I said, fueled in the past the atrocities too awful to imagine, but not too awful to have happened during the Holocaust, and the understanding that that same mutation that turned Zionism into racism with what we know of as the infamous 1975 UN resolution Zionism is racism, that is alive and well on university campuses around North America and the rest of the world, that turned Israel after the 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism, which was an anti-Semitic hate fest, into an apartheid state, that in an Orwellian inversion turned Israel into a genocidal, colonialist country, when in fact the state of Israel is the nation state of Jews, a prototypical indigenous people returned to an ancestral homeland after thousands of years of exile and persecution. And so what has happened over decades all came to a head and intersected and exploded on October 7th. And it happened in various different sort of arenas. I said international institutions, the UN. We know that including Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who reminded the world that October 7th did not happen in a vacuum. And I want to ask him, did 9/11 happen in a vacuum? Did the Holocaust happen in a vacuum? Because that's what happened here on October 7th. And then, of course, morphed into university campuses, actually weaponizing international law and human rights. Human rights, as we know, the secular religious of our time, in order to demonize and delegitimize and apply double standards to the state of Israel, the Jewish nation state, we're the proverbial Jew among the nations, and of course, social media platforms. We would be remiss if we didn't mention those. And the anti-Semitism, which obviously what happens online does not remain online, which fuels and enables what we see then on the streets and on campuses and in every single space. So the anti-Semitism that we see today, the only way to identify and combat it is to do so comprehensively. And as I said, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, a result of a very long democratic process that's been adopted by more than 40 countries and 1,000 entities, has not only to be adopted, but implemented, so that city spaces and law enforcement mechanisms and university campuses, anybody that is actually committed to combating anti-Semitism has to start with defining anti-Semitism, and without defining the current mutated form of it, we cannot identify or combat it.
Absolutely. Michal Cotler-Wunsh, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us about this important topic.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.